We are delighted to have our first keynote. It was supposed to be our first keynote during the 1 week event. Ron Beghetto from Arizona State University, who is not only a fantastic creativity researcher, educational psychologist, but I'm very happy to say a dear friend as well, whose work spans many topics within creativity. I mean, from the co-authoring the 4C model to working more recently on ambiguity and uncertainty and creative openings. And I feel like Ron will give the most amazing creative opening just as a start. So Ron, I'm gonna give you the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Vlad, and thank you, Wendy, and thank you all for attending. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is in the part of the world you're in. And so it is a thrill to be here. I wish we could all be in person and maybe someday in the future. But for now, this I think is a good way for us to kind of explore some of these ideas and do it around the clock, apparently. So what I'd like to kind of share some thoughts on, and I really want this to be an interactive experience. So I encourage you to take the beautiful risk and weigh in with your voice or certainly in the chat at any point. And so I really want these ideas just to be jumping off points rather than just hearing me kind of blather on and on and on. So what I'd like to talk about today in kind of the spirit of what this entire gathering is about is the role uncertainty plays in serendipitous and creative events. And so I'll kind of unpack some of my assumptions around that, and I'll try to anchor it in a very concrete empirical case study. And then from there, I really do want to open it up and invite us all to think about how this applies to my work. Focuses on education, but not just education, how it applies to everyday life. Anytime we have a kind of a planned event or even an unplanned event, how can these kind of ideas help us think through those? And then I think for those of us that engage in the research around these topics, what are some of the kind of methodological challenges and opportunities that this presents as we think through these ideas? I think the challenges are very rich, but I think so are the opportunities. But I think it does require us to maybe move away from the way we typically do creativity studies research and move towards some much more kind of transdisciplinary and generative possibilities. So without further ado, I'm just going to highlight a couple of my core assumptions going into this conversation that we're going to have together today. So what I would assert, and this is kind of the assertion that it runs through the entire core of my work right now, and certainly this presentation, is this idea that uncertainty is kind of experientially primary when it comes to creative, and I would even argue serendipitous events. And so what I mean by that is that it is the kind of catalyst and the condition for new thought and new action, and what ultimately ends up being judged as creative or serendipitous. And so I really like, if you haven't read Wendy Ross's entry in Vlad's Encyclopedia of the Possible on serendipity, I really encourage you to do so. It's a really excellent piece. And in there, Wendy describes that serendipity emerges from this kind of interaction between person or people and the environment. So there is this kind of relational component. So I think it's really important to recognize that, the experience of uncertainty often is theorized as this kind of phenomenological or subjective experience, but really it is this kind of event. So we can't kind of engineer out or erase the environment, that there is this kind of transformative relational component happening with the people and the situations at once. And it is through those kinds of interactions and relational kind of experiences that we see these moments kind of emerge. Okay, so I would also argue that encounters with uncertainty can be planned or unplanned, and that seems a little interesting, I think. I mean, the unplanned is, I think, pretty obvious. We're often surprised by uncertainty, but I would also argue that we can design for uncertainty, and we can do that in education or anytime we design an experience, that we can design for it. And so it is kind of counterintuitive, but what I mean by designing for it is actually creating opportunities for openings to emerge. And so I think we can set up conditions whereby it may be more likely to occur. But again, there is always this kind of chance element to uncertainty. And I think some colleagues actually from Arizona State University are going to be later talking about designing for serendipity. So that whole idea, I think, is very compelling. And I think you'll see this, what I mean by kind of designing for uncertainty later in this presentation. Another assumption that I want to kind of invite you to consider is that encounters with uncertainty can provoke states of genuine doubt, what Peirce, the American pragmatist, talked about as this state where formal kind of typical ways of reasoning break down. Our inductive and deductive reasoning no longer works. Our habits have been disrupted, and we're in this state of genuine doubt. And Peirce would argue that that's where real inquiry really begins, is with genuine doubt, that we can't actually create our own states of genuine doubt. So I'm arguing that there's this kind of link between uncertainty and genuine doubt, but they're different. We can kind of design for uncertainty, but we can't kind of put ourselves into a state of genuine doubt. That's something that kind of emerges in the situation. And so one way to kind of think about this is when we see these little threads of uncertainty and we kind of pull on them, it can kind of destabilize our experience and lead to these states of genuine doubt. And I love, I'm citing Emily Dickinson here, this idea from her poem, and then a plank in reason broke. And I think that's when you realize that you're experiencing a state of genuine doubt, is that you really do not know how to proceed. And that's where Peirce would talk about where creative reasoning, or what Peirce called abductive reasoning, really happens, is where you're trying to kind of puzzle out and work through this uncertainty through these little hunches and conjectures, and you're testing them out. And eventually that might lead to kind of inductive and deductive reasoning and lead to this kind of more stabilized experience. But when we experience uncertainty, it has the potential to destabilize and actually lead to this really destabilized state of genuine doubt. But I think we have to kind of follow that thread sometimes. Other times we're just confronted with it. We are just kind of moved into a state of genuine doubt. So I would then argue that creative and serendipitous events, and this aligns with what Wendy has talked about, are retrospective judgments of the emergent event. So in other words, we don't know an event is creative or that we've experienced a serendipity until we have actually experienced it. We kind of judge that in retrospect. I think that kind of makes sense for creativity if you think about the typical criterion that are used, that it's a new and meaningful experience. We usually don't kind of render that judgment until we've actually had it, or we've produced something new, or we've done something new. I think an argument might be made that we can have these moments of kind of awareness or attunement in the process of a creative experience or in a serendipitous experience where we're kind of noticing something's happening. But typically these judgments are made retrospectively. And this idea that the event is emergent really kind of highlights the dynamic nature of that. So some colleagues and I at Arizona State have talked about this kind of these emergent creative events are these kind of dynamic manifestations, and they're recognized again by ourselves and others in this kind of ongoing interaction and processes and artifacts of the social situations and context. So there is this kind of moment that occurs, but there is this long trajectory of time that's at play. So time and space is not just kind of limited to a particular moment. You know, the past impinges on the present and the present impinges on the future, and vice versa. Okay, so with that in mind, and I promise we're going to get into the concrete, this is kind of my kind of theoretical overlay that I'll invite us to think about, this kind of process model. So what I would argue is we can think about this model happening across, the entire lifespan. It can happen across multiple events. It can represent a particular event. But the idea is, situated within social, cultural, historical context, we kind of maybe start out with this epistemological and ontological stability. And if we think about what does that mean, if we think about that in the context of education, teachers, for example, design and plan lessons. And so they already have in mind, and I would say sometimes to a fault, what is known. So there's a epistemological stability. They know what they're going to teach. Sometimes they even ask known answer questions and have students solve problems that have already been identified and have already been solved, for that matter. And that can lead to problems with creativity and curiosity and engagement. But we'll just say, traditionally, that's the way we do that. We kind of plan a lesson. And there's ontological stability. We understand kind of the nature of reality of the classroom or the event or the school. So this is kind of really, I think, clear when we think about planned events. And this could even be a planned holiday or planned vacation. we think we know what we're going to be doing, and we know the kind of lay of the land somewhat. And so we kind of go into this space with this kind of stability in place. But then we have an encounter with uncertainty. And some uncertainties don't rise to the level that they're even noticeable. Some uncertainties are so profound that we just kind of ignore them. Other uncertainties are kind of disruptive, and I would say kind of optimally disruptive. And this is where if we kind of pull on the thread of them, they can kind of unravel us into these states of genuine doubt, where it's really destabilizing. And sometimes those encounters of uncertainty can seemingly on their own move us into this very destabilized space where we no longer know what we thought we knew, and maybe even the nature of our reality has been disrupted. And I think, many of us have lived through some of those experiences, of course, in our life, but certainly in the past year and a half. And so the interesting idea here is this, I would argue, opens up this horizon of possibilities. When we're in this kind of destabilized space where what we previously known and knew how to do and our understanding of the environment is now completely disruptive, we have new possibilities for new thought and new action. So for creative action and for these kind of serendipitous events. And so, through this horizon of possibilities, we perhaps enact one or two of them and test those out. And that's how Peirce would talk about like genuine doubt, moving from this state of genuine doubt by checking out these little hunches, for example, and testing them out, thinking through them, and perhaps they eventually restabilize what we know, and what we know is now different, and maybe restabilize our reality, and maybe our reality is even different. And you can see this is this kind of ongoing, circular, recursive process. So I invite you to think about this model in whatever your interests are and see if this overlay makes sense for thinking about the emergence of potential creative and serendipitous events and the sense making that happens, and how we move from these kind of moments of stability to destabilizing kind of moments of uncertainty, and through our process of creative reasoning and sense making, that we're able to kind of restabilize into a new state of knowing, or a new state of reality, a new state of existence. So let's zero in a little bit even closer here. I'm going to use an example of education because that's kind of where I do most of my thinking and work. So if we think about this, but I also put life parenthetically in there. So if we think about our lesson, if we're teachers or instructors or professors or whatever the case may be, if we think and we're planning this kind of learning experience, or if we think about life and we have this kind of life plan, or this plan for this kind of event that we're kind of designing, there's always this kind of gap between the lesson and life as planned and the lesson and life as lived. And that's what those little kind of arrows are, that there is always this gap. And there's a curriculum theorist named Ted Aoki from Canada who talked about these kind of gaps as being very generative. And if we recognize that there will always be these gaps, that we can sometimes step away from the plan and move into this kind of generative space of possibility. Now, I would argue that sometimes if we even pull on those threads, particularly in a lesson where there's something planned, the clock is speaking back to us, the lesson plan is speaking back to us. So these kind of material features of the event now have some agency, even the lesson that we or others have designed is actually speaking back to us. Get back to the plan, don't go off script. You're going to go into a curricular rabbit hole and never emerge, something like that. That if we kind of spend time exploring these kind of ruptures, these uncertainties, and we kind of even tug on them, occasionally they can move us into states of genuine doubt where we really don't know, and we really have an opportunity for not only our students that we might be working with to have a creative learning experience, but those of us that even designed or even are facilitating the experience, the instructor, for example. Everyone can benefit from this. And if we document and curate these, so this gets in kind of a methodology question, how can we document and curate these and share those out in the world, then those can have these continuous creative moments and be generative continuously. So I think that's a beautiful idea, that these events, to the extent that we document them, because they're often ephemeral, they often just disappear, or they just are a memory. But if we can somehow document and curate them and share them out, then we can kind of have this continuous creative contributions that happens in these little moments. So we're going to zero in on one of those in a little case study. And we're going to zero in on one that I would say started out as an uncertainty and kind of moved to the level of a genuine doubt. And this is a really rich example, and it's a case study of mathematics teaching from the University of Michigan. And so the teacher in this classroom is also a researcher in mathematics education. And the teacher kept a journal and even talked about the uncertainties that she was experiencing about this and the doubts about, should I pull on this thread even further? Should we explore these things? So this is a tension, especially if you plan something like, do I follow this because I don't know where it's going, and it can drift off into kind of even curricular chaos, or it could be something generative, right? And so there are these tensions at play, but the interesting thing that we'll see in this case study are how the event and the people in that event are willing to kind of step into that and kind of pull on the thread of the uncertainty to the point where it opens up into the space of genuine doubt and ultimately becomes what I would argue a creative and serendipitous event in retrospect. And the beautiful thing about this is they documented it and it curated it and they shared it out in the world. And so we can be benefiting from it now. So here's the context: third grade classroom. The students have been learning about odd and even numbers. And the event starts with the teacher asking students if they have any questions about a meeting they had the day previously with a fourth grade class. And then this was followed by a student. This was going to be followed by students working together on odd and even numbers in small groups. But when the teacher asked students if they had any questions, whenever you ask a question, if you genuinely ask a question like that, it opens up possibilities. And this one student took that opportunity to take it in a completely different direction. And so they talk about how the discussion took an unexpected turn. So uncertainty emerged. But before we go there, any comments, questions, thoughts? Because I do have to shift. Oh, wow, there's a lot in here. Let's see, is there any questions? Anybody have any things they want to share with the entire group?
I didn't see any questions yet,
okay.
But please, by all means, if you want to unmute yourself or if you want to write in the chat. I have to say, Ron, that I really appreciate this idea of accumulating doubt and documenting it. That is excellent.
Yes, excellent. And I like this.
I've just updated my talk to say to say, as Ron said earlier, that's what I was doing. I was just updating my talk. So you must be right, I think, because if I agree, that's probably the guarantee. Yeah. No, I really like the idea. I really like the idea of this moving to this state of uncertainty and doubt, which is productive but also uncomfortable. I think that's a really interesting space to explore.
Also in education, I really like that idea of a genuine question coming from a teacher, as opposed to like that kind of targeted question when the teacher has the answer in their head that they want someone to come back with, and the students just look at you like, I don't know. Whereas if there's this kind of genuine, I don't know either, that uncertainty kind of space, it shifts the dynamic. It's really cool. I love it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Margaret. Thank you for bringing that up. A lot of questions that are asked are these kind of known answer questions. They are these targeted questions. And students will sometimes test that because, I mean, in some households, parents ask those same kind of known answer questions, particularly parents that have spent a lot of time in school. It is this kind of inherited practice. It's really odd, right? And a student will say, if a student brings up something that's unexpected, it can often be stifled as well, right? Because of those targeted questions. And so I think what savvy students learn is a lot of teacher questions are really invitations to play this game of intellectual hide and seek, which is, guess what, I already know and how I want to hear it. So it's not even enough to kind of provide what you think the teacher's getting at, but you almost have to, in schools often, to be successful, provide it in a way that the teacher recognizes it. So the problem with that is not only is that stifling, it privileges sameness. It privileges these pedagogies of sameness, something that Vlad and I have been talking about, wherein students who have different perspectives and that are not maybe understandable to the teacher, right, can be generative if the teacher's willing to be open to that difference. Otherwise, it seals that off and it just teaches this is really a pedagogy of sameness. And to be successful, you need to do what's expected and how it's expected. which of course is sometimes necessary, but in most cases it isn't. And so we'll see, I think in this move, this teacher is somewhat asking a targeted question, but in the moment is willing to shift and be curious about that question, which is, I think, is a really beautiful and uncommon teacherly move often when there's a lot of pressure to cover the content. So let's take a look at this lovely video of the 3rd grade class. We'll continue to open it up for these comments and questions as well. Okay, so I'm gonna make sure I can share sound, optimize for video, and can everyone see this okay? So let me know if there's no sound. And I will probably obnoxiously stop this at some points through here, but this is a brief clip from the larger lesson. And so again, this larger lesson is part of the Creative Commons, and it's available through the University of Michigan.
More comments about the meeting? I'd really like to hear from as many people as possible. What comments you had or reactions you had to being in that meeting yesterday?
I don't have anything about the meeting yesterday, but I was just thinking about 6. I was thinking that it's an odd. It can be an odd number too, because there could be 2, 2, 4, 6, 2, 3 2s. That would make 6, and 2 3s. It could be an odd and an even number.
Okay, so let's stop right there. This is the beginning of the lesson. The teacher asks, do we have any questions about our meeting with the 4th grade class yesterday? And a student says, I've been thinking about 6, the number 6, which I think is a beautiful thing. I mean, how often do you hear that? And then this kid makes this kind of implausible assertion that 6 could be odd and even. Now, I think a fully justifiable in kind of the teacherly world move, and a common teacherly move would be to stop the student and say, okay, why don't you think about that some more? Can somebody help this kid out? You know, we're moving on to this other activity, and just kind of, I call that killing ideas softly, you know, just pleasantly stifling the student and bringing us back on track. Because that's not where the teacher was going. The teacher was just going to ask questions and then put them in small groups and have them do some kind of work on odd and even numbers. But this kid says this seemingly implausible thing. And so right here, I would say, is a defining moment. I call these micro moments. These moments are like these fleeting moments, and they are defining moments. These are the moments, like if there were slogans all around the classroom that said, you know, all ideas are welcome in this space. This is when it really, are they really welcome, right? So this is a defining moment for the teacher, for this class. How the teacher and the other students respond in these moments really defines this space. Is this a space that's going to be open to different perspectives, to exploration, and so on? And so let's watch how this class handles this assertion, which is completely off the rails of where the teacher was intending.
3 things to make it, and there could be 2 things to make it.
And the 2 things that you put together to make it were odd, right? 3 and 3 are each odd.
And I think the 2s were even.
So you're kind of, I think, said then that he wasn't talking about every even number, right? Were you saying that? Some of the even numbers, like 6, are made up of 2 odds, like you just suggested. Other people's comments?
I guess when you said that 6 can be an odd number, I think 6 can be an odd number because six can be an odd number because this is even, odd, even, odd, even, odd, even. How could it be an odd number?
Because
odd, even, odd, even, odd, even, odd.
Because
and 0's not an odd number.
Because there can be 3 of something to make 6, and 3 of something is like odd. Like see, you can make 2, 4, 6, 3 2s to make that, and 2 3s to make 6.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that 6 is odd. Yeah.
Doesn't.
Why not?
Because just because you need 2 odd numbers to add up to an even number doesn't mean it has to be odd.
3 2s. Prove 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Prove it to us.
Okay, so just a little commentary here, which I think is really interesting. So kids are willing to disagree publicly here. You know, Cassandra says, I disagree. Kids can move around and take, you know, teacherly objects like the pointing stick and demonstrate their ideas. And then a student asked the student who made that assertion to prove it. So, I mean, this is a very unusually rich and beautiful learning environment. And they're talking about odd and even numbers. So already, I think there's already, you can see a richness happening here. But let's continue to watch how these ideas play out. And the teacher is just kind of asking questions. The teacher isn't interjecting, and the students aren't appealing to the teacher. They're talking amongst themselves. So this is a very different kind of structure of an environment as well, that's allowing for these kind of emergent events to occur. So let's keep watching.
Okay. Does everybody understand what he's trying to argue? He's saying 6 could be even or it could be odd.
Because,
Well, watch what he's going to prove, and then you can
because
ask him a
see
question
this,
about it.
there's 2. Number 2 over here. Put that there. Cut this here. There's 2, 2, and 2. And that would make 6.
I know, which is even. I think I know what he's saying.
Which is even.
Could you stay there? People have some questions for you.
I think what he is saying is that it's almost, see, I think what he's saying is that you have 3 groups of 2, and 3 is an odd number, so 6 can be an odd number and an even number.
Do other people agree with that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Hey, do other people agree with him? You disagree with that?
Yeah, I disagree with that because it's not according to, like, here, can I show it out? It's not according to how many groups it is. Let's say that I have, let's see. If you call 6 an odd number, why don't we, let's see, 5, 6, 9, let's say 10. 1, 2. And here are 10 circles. And then you would split them. Let's say I wanted to split them by 2. So 1, 2. Oh, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then why do you not call 10 an odd number and an even number? Or why don't you call other numbers and odd numbers and an even number?
I didn't think of that way. Thank you for bringing it up. So I say it's 5, 10 can be an odd and an even.
Yeah, but what about other numbers? Like if you keep on going on like that and you say that other numbers are odd even, maybe we'll end it up with all numbers are odd and even.
Okay, so let's take that back. There's a couple, again, beautiful moments in there. A child, I mean, imagine, this is so instructive for all of us, being able to say out loud in public, I disagree with myself. Thank you for bringing that up. That's beautiful. So there's this kind of impassioned but still kind of leisurely exploration of ideas, right? The teacher isn't like, pay attention, kids are doing other things and then they're paying attention, they're weighing in. And what ultimately happens, I obviously cut this short for time, is they continue to struggle and work through this to the point where they realize that not all numbers have those properties that this one student, Shawn, identified. That there are a certain class of numbers that can be split into these 2 groups of 2, but have an odd set like that, an odd amount of those 2 groups of 2. And so what they ultimately end up deciding is, okay, maybe these shouldn't be called odd and even numbers, but we'll call them a new class of numbers called Shawns Numbers, the kid who first brought this up, right? And so this becomes this kind of mathematically rich, in retrospect, creative event, and serendipitous event, right? There's this kind of chance moment, this kid decides to bring up something completely off script from what even the question that was asked. And through this kind of willingness to explore it in this kind of non-linear, open way, the students were able to arrive at something that was actually a creative contribution. And I would argue even a contribution to us, that even now, these many years later, because it was curated and it's exhibited, it can be used as an artifact for future continuous creative contributions. So I've been talking a lot. We've seen this kind of stimulus. Let's think about that in relation to what we've been talking about. Any other comments, thoughts?
We have plenty of comments and thoughts on the chat. They're all very supportive and insightful as well. I don't see questions yet, but if anyone wants to voice their comments, or if you would like us to read your comment out loud.
Dan has a comment, I think. Dan, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Ron. Really great provocations here. I just wanted to say, I did put it in the chat, but it's hard to switch back and forth. I really taking note of the environment that makes the serendipitous moment possible. So fostering that kind of safe and creative environment. There's so many aspects of that ecology in the video that you pointed out, and others as well, that that's the focus of my work. And so I'm just scanning that whole video. I'm so interested in how those rules have already clearly been established, that the children know they can get up, they know that they can speak respectfully but disagree. They, there just seems to me so much backstory there too. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, that's a lovely insight. It really is this kind of environment. You can almost feel it. You can feel that there's something different happening there. It's almost visceral, where in many other even videos of like mathematics teaching, and I love that it's math as well, which is often such a, a subject matter that's taught in a way, like my daughter, when she was experiencing math, when she heard about mathematicians, I think this was like in 3rd grade, she said, why would anyone ever want to spend all day filling out math worksheets or making math worksheets for other people to fill out? That's her experience of math, right? And that's what mathematicians must be doing, right? Generating or working on math worksheets. And so the idea that this can be this rich, supportive, but also that difference can be maintained in this space. And you can tell they were passionate about their ideas, but they were still respectful of each other and open to each other's ideas, right? So there were openness to difference, and it wasn't about shutting down things. And again, the teacher being able to just allow things to kind of emerge. And so, yes, I think there are these kind of patterns of discourse and behavior and expectation that are probably very different than maybe those kids experience in another classroom, for example, or in a classroom that they might go to. And so I think creating this kind of environment, and one way I like to think about this is it is a risk on the part of the teacher. It is a risk, and I would say it's a beautiful risk for the teacher to pursue something that seems so off topic, because anyone that's ever taught knows that you can go down a curricular rabbit hole and never emerge. And the entire, you're trying to understand what this one student's saying, and all the other students are waiting, and there's these time pressures. But I think being willing to take that risk and inviting your students to take that risk, which obviously this teacher does, actually is the way to build trust. So I love this idea that I've heard elsewhere, the notion that we often think that we need to build a trusting environment in order to take risks together. And the assertion is the inverse of that, that in order to build trust, we need to take risks together first. By taking risks together, we actually build a trusting environment. And I think it starts with the people who are in the positions of power in those environments, right? That they're being vulnerable, they're taking risks, they're exploring these ideas, they're willing to kind of step into the uncertainty or pull on the thread of uncertainty, and try to really understand what is happening here in this moment. And doing so can be very generative. So thank you for that. Other comments, thoughts?
I can see yeah, sorry, go on.
Could I pop in with a couple of questions? I wish I'd heard this before I developed my presentation later this morning. So thanks a lot for that. Just towards the other end of the educational spectrum, moving into higher education, which is where my experience has been for a long time. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the potential impact on the sort of creativity that you're talking about and the development of serendipitous moments of the move to a completely asynchronous online environment, which we keep being told is as good as face-to-face, and I've never believed it. And I suspect that you may think the same. And the second one is increasingly, over the last quarter of a decade, 30 years or so, certainly in the UK and Australia, there's been this move towards planning curricula down to the module level, down to the almost to the hour by hour level, such that you've got very specific learning outcomes, assessment modes, and so on and so forth, which you have to fit into sessions of 10 sessions of 50 minutes each, which again seems to me to be potentially stifling, and very unexciting for those who are participating. So just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aleister. Those are very important observations. I think starting with the first, we were in this profound moment of uncertainty with, having to move things online. And it was, again, a moment of opportunity. But I think sometimes with uncertainty, we're so quick to resolve it that rather than sit with it and explore it, that we ended up, in these kind of Zoom rooms. And we then tried to teach in these Zoom rooms in the same sort of ways that we were teaching, or even worse, in even more minimal ways. And I still think there's even opportunities there. What if, instead of equipping every kid with an iPad, or even if you did, maybe put a GoPro helmet on the, why not move around the environment or go outside? I think we could still use technology in some really interesting ways. But it's still limited to this kind of screen. You don't see much things, even movement out of a room, right? Being mobile with these. And so I think there's still a lot of possibilities with technology, but I think we have to think about it in a much different way, that it's not just a replacement for, what's happening in these environments, because otherwise, yes, those can be even more stifling forms of kind of pedagogical sameness again. And then to your other point, yes, I think we tend to overstructure young people's learning experiences, heavily overstructure them. So part of the work that I'm doing with Vlad, and it's work that I've started earlier on this concept of like lesson on planning and trying to understand how to create spaces for this to happen and to move from pedagogies of sameness to pedagogies of the possible. But in order to do that, we really do need to unstructure some of these constraints, many of which we impose on ourselves and the environments that we design, and some of which that are imposed by external forces, administration, policymakers, and so on. And I'll share a quick anecdote, and then I want to share a visual metaphor that might move us into thinking about different possibilities with respect to this. So I was working with a group of teachers in California, and I was working with a teacher who was getting ready to retire, about 2 years out from retirement, had been teaching for about 35 years. And she was explaining a moment like this where it went off script. It was a beautiful moment, but she was being observed by her school administrators, right? And so in that particular school, they had to post their lesson for everyone to see before, so if an observer came in, they can follow the lesson plan. And that's often the case with any kind of like evaluative or supervising observation. And so the teacher was like, my gosh, did you see that emergent moment, that creative moment? And the administrator said, yeah, I saw that, but I don't see it on your lesson plan. And the teacher's like, of course it wasn't on the lesson plan. It was a totally unscripted moment, and it was beautiful. I could have never planned that. I learned from that. And the administrator retorted again, yes, but I don't see it on the lesson plan. And so, in kind of an act of creative defiance, this teacher realized the only way that her students and she could teach in kind of more unstructured ways, and she ordered a curriculum that was a more creative curriculum. She would hang on her door, testing practice in progress, and no one could come in there and disrupt that. And then what she was actually doing was using these creative curricula to teach. And she's like, only 2 years out, so what's going to happen to me? But I mean, I think that little anecdote kind of illustrates some of the constraints that teachers run up against. But I would still argue, even in very constraining environments, creativity and serendipitous moments still emerge in highly constrained environments. And so I think part of it is attuning ourselves to noticing those, being willing to kind of pursue those, but also just kind of tinkering with our designs to try to open up those possibilities. And to that end, I'm going to show this visual metaphor and invite you all to think about how this visual metaphor might inform your own work, and if it kind of gets at this idea. Okay, so this is, and I've been showing this a lot in my talks recently. This is Picasso's Bowl series, these kind of lithographs. And the idea here is the very first lithograph that was produced, and you can kind of guess which one it was the top left one up here on the screen. So it almost looked like the fully rendered bowl. And so the other people that were working in this workshop assumed that Picasso was done because it's a fully rendered bowl. And then the second one's even more rendered out. And so what ends up happening, however, is Picasso then starts kind of removing the features and definition of this bowl, and ultimately ends up with this kind of wireframe quintessential Picasso bowl that's very generative and creative, and ultimately becomes the Picasso. And so my invitation for all of us to think about is, what if we took these already over-rendered experiences that we design, and I would say most of the experiences we design, whether they be for our everyday life, or even our leisure time, or certainly like planned teaching time, what if we kind of moved towards this wireframe approach? And I feel like that's what that math teacher was doing. The teacher had some things they were going to try to accomplish, and had some kind of wireframe guidelines. They were still talking math, but allowing, these kind of to be determined elements to kind of be defined by the students, or be defined collectively by the event and the experience. And so you start with the wireframe, and then you render out definition through the experience. And I would say doing so is how we kind of move to these pedagogies of the possible. If we design with this kind of wireframe approach, and this is something that Vlad and I have been talking about, this notion of a creative experience, it does, help allow for open-endedness, non-linearity, a plurality of perspectives, and kind of a future orientation, because it's not completely done yet. There are some to be determined elements, many to be determined elements, and some predetermined elements. And it's kind of striking that balance between what are the kind of non-negotiables in this context, but what are the things that we can kind of define together. And so I think this kind of visual metaphor for me is a very powerful reminder of, can I continue to remove some of the things that I feel like I need to define or do for other folks, and be willing to turn that over and allow them to do that for themselves, or join them in that endeavor. So thoughts on this visual metaphor, or any of the themes we've talked about, or anything else? I'm open to going off script completely.
As always, Ron. The chat is buzzing with comments. I'm looking also at the time, because Wendy and I, we had this inspired idea of not putting any breaks during the 24 hours. So we'll have to, we have to go on and on to presentations. But this was just wonderful, and exactly what we needed to start off 24 hours of these topics.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give you a round of applause online, which are really heartfelt. And I wanted to say that we had another idea from our IT colleague who said, we can take photos to document, speaking of documenting doubt and all of that, this event. But if anyone wants to do a selfie with the other people as if we were there in the room, please do it. And I'm going to put my email here, and you can send me the email, and we can showcase some of those photos. So speakers or participants, feel free to do that. So thank you so much, Ron, again. We're going to move on.
Thank you all. Yes, and thank you for the opportunity. I encourage you all to continue to take beautiful risks during this 24-hour marathon of possibilities and serendipities. And also stay in touch. Please contact me if there's anything that you want to kind of talk further about. And maybe we can get this chat documented so I can kind of revisit it later as well.
Right.
But thank you again. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this wonderful event. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you.